Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to the disciples, "For it is as if a man, going on a journey, summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. At once, the one who had received the 5 talents went off and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours.' But his master replied, 'You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Beloved people of God, I wonder if when you woke up and came to church on this really quite beautiful November Sunday morning, you had any clue what you were in for today. Did you? Over these past weeks, Pastor Miriam and I both have made mention of how harsh things get in the lectionary this time of year, especially this year as we read through Matthew's Gospel. Pastor Miriam opened her sermon last Sunday by talking about stress streams, because that's kind of what these parables from Matthew feel like. Stress streams, or maybe nightmares even, about not being prepared, about awful things happening, or about doing something wrong and then having to face the most horrible consequences. You may remember that back in October, we heard that parable about the man who was invited to a wedding banquet but failed to wear a wedding robe, an offense for which he was violently cast out. Last week, it was the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, 5 of whom were wise and prepared and kept their lamps burning through the night, but 5 of whom were foolish and did not, and found themselves banished from the wedding feast. And then, this Sunday, oh dear, we have yet another parable that ends with some poor soul being cast out, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it is again like some terrible nightmare. Sometimes, though, when the gospel reading is really hard, it's possible to turn to the other readings assigned for that day and find a little hope there, a little gospel. You laugh, because not so lucky this week. In Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, there's that truly frightening image of the day of the Lord coming like a thief in the night. And then, that other reading from the prophet Zephaniah is about as terrifying as they come. The great day of the Lord is at hand, the prophet cries out, and it's a day of wrath, a day of gloom and distress, of ruin and devastation. And the reading ends in an almost unbelievably harsh and devastating way. We read that because of human wickedness and transgression, a full, terrible end the Lord will make of all the inhabitants of the earth. There's just no getting around it. Today's readings are full of terror, of harsh and horrible images. Maybe you all wish you had just stayed in bed. But I'd like to offer this thought. And it's this. It's that our scriptures, when they give us these images of terror and destruction, it's not as if our scriptures are just making this stuff up. It's not as if the world is, in and of itself, some idyllic place. And our scriptures are just making up the idea of terror, making up the idea that threat and destruction are real. Maybe for some of us, those of us who have been lucky enough to live in a time that has offered us relatively stable, peaceful, and prosperous lives, maybe for some of us it can seem that the Bible's harsher visions are these strange, otherworldly things, that they're like unreal nightmares meant to frighten us. Maybe if we're cynical into doing the right things or perhaps believing the right things. But I really do think that in fact, the Bible is only describing the world that really is out there. A world that for so many of its inhabitants throughout time and space has been one of harshness and terror. It's not a pleasant thought, but I think it's true. And even in our day, we don't have to look too far or imagine too wildly to see that it's true. Like so many of you, I have been horrified by all that's been taking place in Israel and Palestine, the massacre by Hamas, and then the bombings in retaliation, the threat now of starvation in Gaza, the scenes from those hospitals. People there are living through hell on earth. And then, to bring up something a little closer to home, over these last weeks, a few of us have been reading for the next Christchurch book discussion coming up on December 2nd. The book is The Parable of the Sower, a post-apocalyptic novel by Octavia Butler. I keep reading it at night right before bed, and then my husband Daniel has to keep listening to keep hearing me say how horrifying it is. Written in the 1990s, it takes place in California, in an imagined version of what California is like in the then far-off 2020s, when in the world of the novel, climate change and social inequality have wreaked havoc on everything. Society has collapsed into a shell of itself, and violence and desperation are everywhere. It's a terrifying vision. And even though the book was published in 1993, guess what year it became a bestseller? 2020. Maybe the story Butler tells had started to seem just a little too prescient and real. But my point is that visions of a world gone wrong are not something made up by the biblical writers. They're just part of the reality of the world that the Bible acknowledges and does not try to hide. We live in a very broken world, and sometimes catastrophe does loom. But the real question is, how then shall we live? If we allow that catastrophe is real, that it is part of human existence on this fragile planet, then the question becomes, how then shall we live in the face of it? How shall we live when terror does loom large in our imaginations? Now that is a question that I think the scriptures really do want to answer, starting with the Apostle Paul, who says, in the face of hardship and impending doom, put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. Encourage one another and build up each other, as indeed you are doing. In other words, face the crisis. Face whatever comes with faith, hope, and love. These three. And you know, there's a way in which I think this is the point of that gospel reading too. The two servants in the story who are praised, who are invited to enter the joy of their master, they are the ones who took what had been given them and used it boldly, fearlessly. Though, of course, the metaphor here is one of money. A talent is an ancient coin. This parable has always been understood to be about so much more than that. In fact, our English word talent, meaning gift or skill, actually arose from interpretations of this very parable. The point of the parable, then, is an invitation, yea, even an admonition, to spend one's whole life in the service of this one who gave the gift. And not insignificant here is the actual monetary value of a talent. As some of you may already know, just one single talent was worth an astronomical sum to the first hearers of this parable, equal to something like 20 years of labor. It was a fortune. And so this parable actually speaks of a kind of abundance. Our lives are filled with these innumerable, uncountable gifts, precious gifts. And the call is to use them according to our abilities, according to the needs of our neighbors. The one thing we may not do is bury them in fear. And you see, I think that is actually the key to this parable. This one poor soul is ruled by his fear. He thinks he knows that his master is cruel and unforgiving, and so then, paralyzed by his fear, he buries his talent. He neither uses it nor risks it. And thus his fears are only confirmed. And in that fear, all is lost. It's a heartbreaking parable, but it warns of something that is all too true. Living in fear is itself the catastrophe, while on the other hand, risking our lives, risking, using, sharing all we have in faith, hope, and love, this is what brings the only true joy there is. And one last thing. These readings together reminded me of a story I once heard from what you might call a shirt-tail relative of mine who lives in the Chicago area. She was serving on the church council of their smallish sized congregation in Evanston, Illinois. And this was back somewhere around 2009. You might remember that there was no small financial crisis right then. The housing market had collapsed and all kinds of people were struggling. And those struggles had impacted this congregation too, as they were facing at that time a significant budget shortfall. And at one council meeting, scheduled to address this budget issue, someone, kind of out of the blue, suggested that maybe what they needed to do was something crazy. Maybe instead of focusing on their fears and their worries about there not being enough, maybe what they should do instead was announce a big capital campaign and give it all away. You know, as you do when you're worried about your finances. But this relative of mine told me that what was truly crazy, what was what happened next. The idea caught on. It started to spread. Even among these otherwise rather ordinary, fiscally conscientious Lutheran council members. My relatives said that at the council meeting, they all together almost started to get giddy. There was this crazy joy in the room. And you know what? They did it. They did that crazy thing. They announced and pulled off a capital campaign for $50,000 in the middle of a Great Recession, and they gave it all away. They called it the Hope Fund. And in case you're curious, the congregation made it too. You can look them up, Grace Lutheran in Evanston. They're still there. Beloved people of God, crises and calamities are nothing new. But what is new, every hour of every day, is the faith, hope, and love that are born in us, in and through the power of Christ's resurrection, in us. In that hope, we are given to living daring, generous, loving, and compassionate lives. Let fear be damned, literally, so that we may live in the love of Christ. In Jesus' name, amen.